So hi, welcome to Anchor Reviews. This is Tyler from Anchor Reviews.
I'm Steven Lawson, aka the Big Steve, on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram.
So we are in ancient Egypt, or it's more specifically in Egypt right now, and we're trying to decipher some hieroglyphics, and we have our own AI system to try to translate the hieroglyphics. And for my AI translating these hieroglyphics, it translates as "Death will come on swift wings to whomever opens this chest."
Dear pesky plumbers, the Koopalings and I have taken over the Mushroom Kingdom.
All right, so that's what your AI says. Well, this is a different movie and not the Mario film. But
Fair, yes.
anyway, so this is our review on Lee Cronin's The Mummy. Now, the thing about this movie is that it is written and directed by Lee Cronin, best known for writing and directing Evil Dead Rise, which I would say is a better Evil Dead movie than the 2000 remake from the 2010s, which I thought was overrated.
Hmm.
Although I don't think it's the most overrated horror film of the 2010s. Get out. Anyway, so we have this new movie out now, and it's not the first time Universal's remade it. So the original Mummy was from 1932, starring Boris Karloff. I don't know if you've seen the original Mummy movie, Steven.
I've seen bits and pieces of it. I don't know if I've seen the whole thing through.
Okay. Of course, we've both seen the previous remakes of The Mummy, one from 1999, the
Yeah.
other from 2017. However, unlike those other Mummy movies that were released by Universal, this is the first Mummy remake that, of course, is loosely based on the or attached to the original Boris Karloff. That is not released by Universal. Instead, it's being released by New Line Cinema, aka Warner Brothers, and this one, we have basically a family is troubled after a daughter gets kidnapped. And then years go by, and it turns out that this little girl was now found inside a sarcophagus over in Egypt. And she's brought back over to America. But then, bad things start to happen and so on and so forth without spoiling it. So, anyway, Stephen, what do you think of Lee Cronin's The Mummy? Or the title of the movie was called The Lee Cronin's Mummy.
Yes, the Lee Cronin's mummy. They never even mention who Lee Cronin is in the whole movie. It's just his titles in the credits. No,
Yeah.
but
Just the way
um,
the text was, like I said, I know it's supposed to be called Lee Cronin's The Mummy, but the way they phrased it was, if you read it from top to bottom, it says the Lee Cronin's Mummy.
yes, absolutely, as if he personally made the mummy. But yes, Um, no, I enjoyed it for what it was. I honestly hadn't put together what Lee Cronin did before this, and as soon as you mentioned the Evil Dead movie, I was like, oh, okay, that makes so much sense in retrospect because there was a lot of blood, a lot of gore, a lot of like disgusting shock value that was very much in those movies. As for the story as a whole, I think Tyler and I are in agreement that it was probably too long at parts and could have been paced a little better, but there were definitely some things like in terms of the scares and the shock value that I think this is probably one of the better versions of like trying to actually scare you with the premise. I will say, I mean, I don't know if we want to get into spoiler territory at some point, but this kind of felt like just the mummy fused with like the exorcist in a lot of ways, which borrows from, of course, a very successful property in its own right. um, and I think it had some interesting moments, but like we'll mention, I'm sure the star of the show that I kept harping on, aka Egyptian Sandra Bullock, who I'm sure as soon as people see the movie, they will be like, "Oh, that's who he means," because it is an important character. But she really is there. Me talking to therapist, Egyptian Sandra Bullock is going to get me. Egyptian Sandra Bullock isn't real and can't hurt you. Meanwhile, Egyptian Sandra Bullock, ooga booga booga. So yeah, that was pretty good. And I mean, the mystery of it, I did find pretty compelling too, because it was kind of a slow burn in that regard. But there were definitely elements to improve. I feel like we kind of could have guessed the ending before it was coming, that type of thing. So, but what did you think, Tyler?
So with this movie, again, like you were saying, we're in agreement in ways where this movie worked and didn't work in ways. But before I continue on to that, just a little bit of backstory here. So this movie was technically announced back in 2024, but it wasn't named as a Mummy movie until about 2025. And I do remember at the time there were several different test screenings, partially from this company called One Iota. And from what I saw, from at least this is what a AI I was using that said it was according to on expert mode this I had on. It was looking at what the test screen audiences have. It's like anonymous sources, and a lot of them were saying that they didn't really like the movie that much. They were saying that it was less of a mummy movie and more like an Evil Dead movie or Pet Cemetery. And there's even a rumor going around that James Wan, who was a producer on this movie, part of Atomic, Monster Pictures, walked out halfway through the movie.
Mhm.
Now, that's just rumor. Maybe he did. Maybe he got grossed out at some point during the film and had to like, you know, collect himself or whatever. I'm just because that did happen with some of the original Universal monster movies when they test screened Frankenstein. There were some people who were so scared of the movie that they ended up having to walk out of the auditorium, kind of pull themselves together and then go back in
Mhm.
because that did happen historically at the time, roughly 95 years ago. It's hard to believe that movie's been out that long. And if you want to read more about the history of that movie or any of the other mummy movies from Universal, then I highly recommend checking out a book, 100 Years of Universal Monster Movies, available both in ebook digital and in print. And while you're at it, check out my other book, Disney's Live Action Movie Bombs, 1979 2019, also available in ebook digital and in print. So back to the video itself. So the thing about this movie that kind of, well, I'll get to the cast soon, but there are some things about this movie. I don't know how intentional it was, or maybe it was just by coincidence. But there's a few connections with other Mummy movies. For example, we have a few sandstorms that could objectively be seen from both 1999 and 2017 remakes of The Mummy. There's a moment where a character is a scorpion, which is similar to when the Scorpion King makes that deal with the Egyptian god Anubis and the Mummy returns. And even a moment where we had this plane crash, and I instantly thought of that plane crash scene from the Tom Cruise Mummy movie. And at some point when this movie comes to home video, I just want to do an edit where intercuts like that movie and this movie together.
Yeah, that was a really good observation for sure. The parallel there.
Yeah, I remember there was a bunch of tweets from Blumhouse, which is also a production company on this movie, a bunch of tweets and a bunch of caps was saying like, Brendan Fraser is not in this mummy. Brendan Fraser is not in this mummy. A bunch of like, Bart writing, on the chalkboard in detention in a way.
Right.
And the thing about related to is originally this was going to be by Universal, I'd imagine, but it was not released by them. And I imagine the two reasons why is that one was probably because they decided they wanted to make another Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser, which I'm excited about. And they imagined they were like, well, releasing two Mummy movies within a few years apart from each other would be a conflict of interest for us.
Mhm.
And also, too, I think what happened was, like thinking about it recently, how ever since The Invisible Man, it was like, let's do a bunch of experimental movies. And a lot of them haven't done that well financially. And I imagine after the failure of the 2025 Wolfman was also written and directed by the same guy who wrote and directed The Invisible Man, which was Lee Winnell. I imagine they probably saw that and they saw the Mummy and they're like, well, this is too unconventional. Let's go back to making more mainstream conventional movies with our monster characters, which is, I imagine, why they decided to eventually greenlight another Mummy with Brendan Fraser. In a way, it kind of reminds me of what happened with Sony and their Spider-Man esque character movies. Like they had success with Venom and they tried with other characters and they all bombed at the box office. Even the Venom sequels did average at best. So that's why I like to compare and contrast those movies with the more experimental phase of the Universal monster movies.
Mhm.
So, getting into the characters themselves, now the only actor I recognized in the cast was the father character, who's the main character, who's played by Jack Rayner. And now Steven knows him best as playing one of the characters in Transformers Age of Extinction.
That's correct. The Shane, the driver boyfriend guy,
Yeah.
and also the guy that is in Midsummer that gets burned alive in a bear suit.
Yeah, no, that movie is all about how femininity can be toxic too.
Sure.
And the thing about him with his Transformers character, seeing who plays his wife in this movie, who's played by uh, Leia Costa,
Hmm.
and like she's almost like a decade older than him. I feel like she was kind of miscast in a way. They didn't
Hmm.
really have that much of chemistry. I mean, it's not as bad as the non-existent chemistry between the husband and wife characters in the Running Man movie with Glenn Powell
Hmm.
from like last year. But I gotta say that I'm not. I don't want to be like Andrew Tate esque, like, but I gotta say
Good.
the woman is a downgrade compared to his love interest in that Transformers movie.
I can see that. Yeah, I honestly, I think I was trying to justify it in my head with like the region they were in with Cairo. Was she like from there, but then it became clear very quickly, no, that's not the case. Maybe it's more like where the husband was working, being in broadcast, which was like a thing, but not really.
Yeah, it's
It
kind of
was very brushed over quickly.
yeah, it's like he was just there as a reporter, but there, I mean, there's kind of investigating that he does, but kind of anyone could have done that
Hmm.
too. I'm trying to remember his name. It was something Cannon.
But he had an award, which was so funny, like award for broadcast journalism for being Mr. Mid.
But also, I just laughed every time I was realizing that his last name was Cannon, and I just instantly kept thinking of like Nick Cannon.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, every time when I hear his name, I always instantly think of there's a movie he was in back in the 2000s, and it was a painfully dated joke
Hmm.
where he's like in the water, he gets an accent, or whatever, and he says, "I think I swallowed Nemo." Yes, but speaking of timely things, we're talking about like mummy references here and there and that.
Hmm.
So I don't know if you're aware of this, Stephen, but there was some drama online recently about these two people who were in the show called Girls. I never watched the show, but apparently there's an actress named Lena Dunham who has accused Adam Driver, who's a pretty big actor right now. He's best
Hmm.
known for being Kylo Ren in the Star Wars sequel trilogy,
Yeah.
and she accused him at one point of getting carried away in character in that he ended up like throwing a chair at her. And when she said that, I instantly thought of that moment from the 1999 Mummy when Rick threw that chair at Benny.
Yeah.
Let me guess, spring cleaning.
Yeah, that was also a funny, notable reference for the time.
Yeah, it was just good timing too with that. But yeah, with this one, with the other cast members as well. Speaking of Leah Dunham, that when that one little girl was possessed, there's some certain camera angles where she kind of looked like her in the face,
Hmm.
very creepy looking.
Sure.
And I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, the character was named Katie
Hmm.
in that, and she was kidnapped, and the actress was played by Natalie Grace. And there's like a bunch of other actresses with a similar name, so it's kind of hard to find a solid IMDb profile, at least a photo from her.
Sure. It was very hard, as someone that someday hopes to have kids, to see this poor child being so tortured by ooga booga mommy stuff throughout, especially when you see like how sweet she was in the beginning. I will say that was one of the more effective parts, other than the mystery. But there a lot of the character motivations, other than like daughter gone, sad. Like I
Yeah,
don't know how compelling for people that might be.
and speaking of that, I'm glad you brought that up at the beginning because I noticed a little bit of foreshadowing when they said that her nickname was Butterfly,
Hmm.
because like a butterfly starts as a larva, then goes to a cocoon, and then through a change as a butterfly, similar to what we see with this character in the movie.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to think what else I wanted to bring up here. Oh yeah, so the soundtrack of this movie was done by Stephen McKeon. I'm sorry if I butchered that last name, but he also did the soundtrack for Evil Dead Rise, and I gotta say, not half bad for the same guy who did the music for Norm of the North.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I hope to never sit down and watch that movie from start to finish, but I imagine that movie's better than what we just saw.
You mean the one we saw is better than Norm of the North?
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine it would be a safe bet. Another thing that stood about this movie to me, aside from all the gory stuff, which I feel like at times could be a little unintentionally comical or over the top, where I feel like they could have cut stuff here and there, where especially not just the gore, they probably could have trimmed down in moments, was a little bit much, but there are some scenes I feel like went on a little bit too long, especially one moment where this one daughter character gets up to go to the bathroom, and then after she does her business, and then she comes out of the bathroom and then hears like her sister talking to her. I'm like, you could have trimmed that down with her like already coming out of the bathroom where you already hear a noise cue that the toilet's flushing, like she did her thing,
Hmm.
and then she's walking out. We don't have to see her leaving her room, going to the bathroom, and that just kind of a little bit excessive. Like they could have been a little bit more, effective and efficient with that.
Yeah, that shot kind of confused me because I thought they were framing it kind of like things in Hereditary, where like she would be lurking in the shadows, but then she just wasn't. It was just the long shot of the hall, and it clearly turned our attention away from the previous shot. So some shot choices were a little confusing.
Yeah, it made more sense than the Invisible Man when they did something like that because it kind of added to the paranoia. It's like, is that Invisible Man in this room or not? And I
Hmm.
did like that. It was playing with that aspect, but this one just felt like the director maybe had a little bit too much creative control. Like, I don't know what the production budget on this movie was. They haven't announced it, at least by the time we're recording this.
Hmm.
But related to all the, what I call a little excessive, not just in the violence, but also the runtime, now, I know this is not released by Universal, but technically it's a Universal monster movie because it is a remake of the original Mummy with Boris Karloff from Universal. This is the longest Universal monster movie ever made at 2 hours and 14 minutes, which means that it's longer than the likes of The Mummy Returns and Van Helsing. And those movies felt like they were justified in the runtime because they're action adventure movies.
Hmm.
This is more of a horror film, so I felt like there were moments that could have been trimmed down and be more efficient in the runtime.
For sure. Yeah. It trying to think where it felt like it dragged, but basically in the middle, quite a bit. Like the beginning, I think had enough going on to hold our attention, but and then the end kind of picked up as well, but the middle kind of just it felt very The Exorcist, but Welcome to Modern Family.
Yeah, no, right? I mean, it was just kind of interesting where there's one moment where that detective character is searching in Egypt, and because of the framing, they look like she was over in the Americas. And I was thinking to myself, like, oh, meanwhile on Breaking Bad.
Yeah. Oh, that was funny. And then I don't know if we're going to talk about spoilers at any point, but
Well, we could do it right now. So just, fast forward to the part in the video where we give our thoughts on the movie, but we can do spoilers now.
yeah, the only major death being Grandma, and she just gets yeeted out of the window and then eaten by wolves. That was so excessive.
Not just that, but basically the possessed daughter character basically treats her body like those main characters did to that one actress from Scary Movie 3 when they
Hmm.
go like the wake and they think that, oh, it's awake. No, she's awake, she's alive, and they're trying to bring her back to life and that.
Yeah, absolutely. And they played with that so much.
I was just thinking of that, and it's kind of bizarre too, where it's like the little girl crawls out of the ceiling and no one hears that.
Hmm.
It's like there's no music playing or anything to distract it with. You tell me that no one at least heard that
Right,
happening.
clawing through the floor, you
I mean,
know?
sorry, the ceiling.
Yeah, the
Well, it was
ceiling.
it was her floor on top where she was at, but it's the ceiling what we saw. So technically, you can go either way with it when describing it.
Right. And they had the little the Anne Frank cubbyhole scares that were going on.
But yeah, I mean, what's wild about that too was that there's a bunch of this cobweb stuff they have, but it
Hmm.
made no sense logically because you could tell they're storing like wrappings for like Christmas presents and other stuff like that. So
Like recent, yeah.
yeah, I don't get why there's so much. That was just pure, theatrical movie stuff with all the
Sure.
cobwebs that they have
Yeah, and
in
then
that one.
the daughter that was like pulling out all of her teeth so she could wear the grandma's dentures. And then I mean a big part I think for both of us the film that was caught on tape of like the ceremony to transfer the mummy curse. I think that was one of the more effective parts.
Agreed.
Um, it definitely felt like catching the Bohemian Grove ceremony on video or something like that. Just very very occult and eerie and uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, what would you give Lee Cronin's The Mummy?
I've been wrestling with that. Um, Originally, I was probably going to give it like a low B grade. I think there's still probably a case for that, but as we're kind of analyzing the writing and stuff like that, I may want to lower it to like a 78, 77, something like that. So still in that good range, but um, some room for improvement. What do you think, though?
All right, sounds like we're roughly on the same page now. The thing is, I do appreciate that this remake of The Mummy is trying to be a horror film, unlike the Tom Cruise Mummy, where it couldn't decide if it was trying to be an action adventure movie or a horror film. It was trying to do both, and also just doing way too many different things in terms of how many writers were on that movie, is
Yeah.
why it's kind of a jumbled mess. And speaking of that movie, they actually started filming that movie 10 years ago this month, by the way,
Wow.
which, hard to believe it's, been that long.
Time flies.
Yeah, and the reason why I know there's so many screenwriters on this movie, aside from looking at IMDb, is that if anyone's been to Universal Studios over in Florida, if you've ever been to the horror makeup show's lobby, they have on display props from that Mummy movie, and in that lobby, there's actually a on display a shooting script, and there's like a ton of writers, and some of those writers are not credited on IMDb or at least on the main writing cast for the writing credits. So it goes to show how there were too many cooks in the kitchen with that movie, which is one of the main issues it had. But back to this Mummy movie at hand, I felt like it's not necessarily a Mummy movie. It felt again
Hmm.
like an Evil Dead film. I feel like it was, doesn't really feel like a Mummy at certain points. This movie felt more like an extension of the Evil Dead series and less of a Mummy movie. In a way, it's kind of like that Wolfman remake from a year ago,
Hmm.
where it was kind of like a remake in name only or a name make, where it's just hijacking the marquee value of an iconic movie and doing something completely different, where it's more separate and doesn't really have any identity with the original movie. Although to be fair, this one does feel more connected to a Mummy movie than Lee Winnell's Wolfman movie to being a Wolfman movie,
Hmm.
the Lon Chaney Jr. version from 1941. And I was afraid that this one's going to be overly about inherited family trauma, which that wasn't really necessarily the case, which is very cliched nowadays, which
Yeah.
Wolfman was definitely about. Well, this one, yeah, it has some family trauma in there, but it wasn't like inherited family trauma. It was more about a commentary, at least from I got it on the surface, about human trafficking, how that's very relevant these days, and
Yeah.
how the woman that was basically tricked that little girl was kind of had these Ghislaine Maxwell vibes about her.
Yeah, and in the family, sort of like almost a groomer mindset of, not only is it acceptable, but we've had to do this 82 times. Like, what? That's a crazy thing to like just be dropping for your kids. And then like the daughter had clear signs of torture too. Just at many points, a reality check would have been nice somewhere.
Yeah, of course. I would say in terms of it's better than that Lee Winnell Wolfman movie. And how would I rank it with other Mummy movies from Universal? I definitely put it above both Tomb of the Dragon Emperor and the Tom Cruise Mummy and Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy and some of the Karras Mummy movies from the 1940s, at least those. However, I definitely prefer the first two Mummy movies with Brendan Fraser and, of course, the original Boris Karloff. So it has moments. I feel like it's a little bit too excessive in the violence and in the runtime,
Hmm.
and it could have been a little bit more connected with the Mummy in ways, or at least a Mummy film in general. But yeah, there were effective moments here and there with how it was shot and edited, or at least in terms of the scares in ways which kind of sounds a little contradictory, but in ways it works and in ways it didn't work. And it was shot well, at least in cinematography, and the soundtrack and sound design was pretty solid too,
Hmm.
and makeup work. So as for Lee Cronin's The Mummy, I would give it about 2.5 stars out of 4.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and we're overall in agreement about the relative hierarchy. I don't have nearly as much authority on the older Mummy movies, and of course, you're an expert of the Mummy, like I am of Transformers and Universal stuff in general. I would say more so, but I agree it was excessive, but in a way that if you like the Evil Dead movies, you will definitely enjoy this. The Mummy aspect was more, if anything, the positive because it was keeping a demon at bay, basically. So that's I agree with you that it. You could argue it almost was a shoehorned element, but I think it still worked. It worked for what it was, and it was fine to you know decent, just not super.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely better than Lee Winnell's Wolfman, because at least this one kept my attention from beginning to end. There was
Hmm.
really no moment where I was really that bored with the movie, which is good.
Sure.
And at least, again, like I said earlier, it was more felt more connected as a Mummy movie than Lee Winnell's movie as a Wolfman movie. And speaking of the other Mummy related movies, I remember reading someone made a comment by saying like how about the Brendan Fraser movies, how if Imhotep is juicy, I guess that makes the Dragon Emperor crusty.
Yes, this movie was promised to us 3,000 years ago.
Because
Yeah.
how old the hieroglyphics are.
No, I was also thinking as soon as we came in that like Ninja Turtle spinoff, the mummy, that
Oh, real
animated.
mummies or
Yeah,
whatever that show's called.
mommy's alive. That one.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
the one. Okay, yeah. Yeah, but speaking of, I am most certainly excited about that new Mummy movie with Brendan Fraser coming out.
Mm,
And it's hard to believe that this is the first Universal monster movie, or at least related one, that's new that we happen to see in theaters. I guess we had different scheduling conflicts. We were able to see it one on the big screen as a new one.
mhm.
We've seen like some of the re-releases in the same auditorium, but we never sat down and watched any of the newer ones when they were in theaters. Well, it's nice to finally do that for a change.
True, very true.
All right. So anyway, this is Tyler from Anchor Reviews.
And Steven, aka the Big Steve, on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok.
And we hope you enjoyed this episode of After the Credits on Anchor Reviews, and we hope to make a lot more in the future. Please like and subscribe. Imhotep, Imhotep, Imhotep,
Can you please pass the
Imhotep.
wipe? I ran out of mine.
Yeah, poop stained mummy with the bandages.